If this channel isn't BlackJupiter, then my name isn't Agent Random, and today isn't the 17th anniversary of The World Ends With You, everyone's favorite Japanese role-playing game. Assuming by everyone, I mean discounting over 99% of the human population of Earth. Like all foreign media, a number of changes were undergone when it was brought over here to the West, so I thought in celebration of its anniversary, it would be fun to cover all of the regional differences in the game. Oh, wait a second, that's not buzzwordy enough. Today I want to cover localization. There we go. For whatever reason, this has been a really hot topic with this series, with a lot of people aggressively whining about how the localization is the worst thing ever and how it killed their cat. It isn't. And a lot of people aggressively claiming how it's the best thing ever and is a second coming of Christ in video game text form. It also isn't. All of that nonsense has seemed fairly silly to me, and the online discussion of the topic has led to people thinking that you can't talk about the localization without starting 4 new world wars. And that's a huge shame, since the localization is one of the most interesting aspects of the series. Taking an academic look at what was changed, why it was changed, and why certain changes do or don't work is something that I've had a blast learning about. So surely we can just leave it at that and have a perfectly normal comment section full of perfectly normal people. Okay, so originally I wanted to talk about the localization across the whole series in one fell swoop, with a primary focus on the second entry from a couple years ago, since that seemed to be where all the action was. Or at the very least, that's where all the discourse was, so I assumed that's where all the most major and notable changes were. But as I did more research, I found that the first game had way more going on with it than I thought. Enough for me to feel like that one needed a whole video on its own. But wait! If you're watching this video, then there's a good chance that you've been on the World Ends With You fandom wiki before. Well, I want to announce that because fandom sucks in more ways than 10, the World Ends With You wiki is doing what is called a fork. Basically, that means that all of its current staff is leaving it behind and moving to a new website called NTWEWY.wiki, or The Wiki Ends With You, which is just a much better name, don't you think? If y'all could support this new website by changing any bookmarks that you may have from fandom to the new site and or by spreading the word, that would be massively appreciated. For the record, the old site will still be up, but it will not be updated or maintained by its original staff any longer. Also, I want to give a shout out to Hattie Underground, who orchestrated this whole thing and put gallons of blood, sweat, and tears into making it all happen. Seriously, we never would have escaped if not for her. Okay, now back to localization. Now, because I don't want to be the kind of guy who goes on long tangents about subjects that I know hilariously little about, I went and harassed a member of the community who's fluent in English and Japanese to bring you a deeper analysis of the series' localization. I've read through a lot of their research in the past about the sequel's localization, but when it came to the first game, I was much more in the dark. So after spending weeks having a back and forth with them on the subject, along with reading through a Tumblr blog about the game's localization written by someone named Melissa, I'm going to present to you what I've learned. When it comes to spoilers, aside from showing scenes from towards the end of the game out of context, this video will be mostly spoiler-free. That said, there is a pretty big spoilery change in localization that I'll talk about at the very end. I'll hand out a spoiler warning beforehand, don't worry. Okay, first off, a lot of people aren't 100% up to speed with what localization actually is, and the term is often confused with translation. So real quick, let me explain the difference between the two. Translation is the act of taking something like text written in one language and retyping it in another. Think Google Translate. So say that I'm a geology fan and I want to talk about rocks in Japanese. I type rock into Google Translate and wait a second, that's the wrong kind of rock. Localization would be any further modification the text receives beyond that. Quite literally, it means to alter the material in any way with the aim to make it feel more local to a different audience. This can be due to linguistic quirks like I just showed, but also due to cultural differences. And The World Ends With You is one of the most interesting examples of this, since it's so heavily defined by the culture of mid-2000s Japan, or at least the Japanese releases. That culture does not work identically in different nations. As a result, the series has practically been defined by its localization, even down to what it's called. This is probably one of the most well-known pieces of trivia for the franchise, but it's only referred to as The World Ends With You internationally. The original Japanese name for the franchise is Subarashiki Kono Sekai, or It's a Wonderful World. Most fans know that The World Ends With You is name-dropped by mentor character Sane Hanekoma partway through the game as life advice to the lead character Neku Sakuraba, and this arguably acts as the game's message summarized into one sentence. It's a Wonderful World is also name-dropped in a similar regard, but it instead shows up as a part of everybody's favorite copy pasta from the last quarter of the game. What a wonderful world such would be. The name was changed internationally due to copyright issues. This meant that before Square had settled on the international title, they were not allowed to refer to the game as It's a Wonderful World internationally and had to call it Subarashiki Kono Sekai in press info. This is because a film in 1939 already had the trademark for It's a Wonderful World. Although, if I had to give my thoughts on the subject, It's a Wonderful World is like 2 inches away from getting Mario storied. You know how the first Paper Mario was called Mario Story in Japan before they just sort of adopted the localized name in later entries? A similar thing kinda happened here. Starting from the mobile port onward, the Japanese logo for the World Ends With You was altered. Originally, the logo read Subarashiki Kono Sekai with text underneath that read It's a Wonderful World. But starting in the mobile port, the text underneath read The World Ends With You, which is not what that translates to. Then, when the animation released, Square opened an official World Ends With You Twitter account that was primarily aimed at Japanese Twitter users. I assume this account was created because they realized that the only official account they had prior to this was on DeviantArt. But they opted to call it at TWEWYPR instead of at SBSKPR or something. And then, without getting into spoilers for it, the plot of the second entry in Neo just feels more like The World Ends With You than It's a Wonderful World. That is all to say, I'm pretty sure the devs prefer the localized name, and I wouldn't be surprised if someday the name changed globally to The World Ends With You. The name change obviously altered a lot of graphics across the series, but there are also other examples of the game's assets needing altering. Probably the most popular case of this is the cat mural in the game's Uragawa district. In the Japanese version, one of the eyes of the depicted cat has a St. Peter's cross, which is either a super Christian or super anti-Christian symbol depending on who you're asking. So likely as a result of Nintendo of America's policies on religious imagery, the eye was changed to be a star just like the other eye. And for the record, this also applies to the mural's appearance in Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance. Another similar change is the Q floor/front screen, which internationally reads "You have 7 days," but in the original Japanese it read "Time limit within 7 days." Ultimately, this was probably just a grammatical correction, but the change is also reflected within the animation. The Japanese release used "Time limit within 7 days," while all international versions used "You have 7 days" regardless of what the VO language actually is. I actually don't know how common it is for an anime to have regional differences baked in at initial creation like that. Let me know if there's any other examples of that sort of thing happening, because I think it's pretty cool. Especially in this scenario where the changes directly aim to match the different versions of the source material. In the English game, you attack with items called pins, but in Japanese, they're called badges. One of the really powerful and rare pin sets has a mechanic where each item can level up and evolve into different pins in the set. But at the very end of this line, the pin Eden's Door would evolve into 1 yen when evolved. A classic case of really weird game design choices that the devs throw in because it's funny. This wound up being cut from the English game, and probably because of the same philosophy that got us a different version of Mario 2. A couple of the pin designs were also changed between versions whenever a pin was deemed to depict something too Japanese. This has never really been a change that I've loved all too much because it's just so unnecessary. Like, was an American player really going to be disgusted by a pin depicting a Japanese gaming magazine? For a more interesting change, or rather lack thereof, the creature enemies in the game, Noise, are referred to as Noise in both English and Japanese. This is notable because Noise is not a term that gets used often in casual Japanese speak. So Neku's reaction to hearing the term for the first time is appropriately different in each language. Speaking of Noise, both versions of the original DS release also had different soundtracks. From what I gather, composer Takaharu Ishimoto just made too many songs for them to actually fit in, so they added in some of the extras in the international release by replacing some of the Japanese tracks. This is why there were originally 2 soundtrack releases for the game. The first is the Subarashiki official soundtrack, but the second one is called Subarashiki Kono Sekai plus The World Ends With You, since it contains most of the songs original to the international version as well as new remixes from songs that first appeared in the Japanese version. The songs Satisfy, Make or Break, Psychedelic, Noisy Noise, Imprinting, and Fighting for Freedom were all exclusive to the Japanese release, while the 1-star, Emptiness and, Twister Gang Mix, Transformation, 3 Minutes Clapping, and Deja Vu were exclusive to the international version. On top of that, the songs Owari Hajimari and Lullaby for You got English lyrics for use in the English version. When the game was ported to mobile devices, every song made for the series, except for Lullaby for You due to rights issues, were included. The only time something like that all ever happened again was in Nioh, where the credits song Little Things can play with either Japanese or English lyrics depending on your language. There are also plenty of other instances of songs having different versions sung in other languages, but they're all just as available regardless of region. Like, there's an English and Japanese version of Twister, but you'll get both regardless of how you play the game. As for the protagonists, the main group of characters in the series are referred to as players because they are playing a big contest. In Japanese, apparently there isn't really as much of a strict term for this. They can be referred to as anything from participant to psych user. The term player was probably used across the board in English to up the cool factor of the premise because that was really essential to the core of the game and may not be otherwise conveyed in English. In the Japanese version of the game, there's a gag when reading people's minds where you might find a pedestrian who's thinking in English. They're a foreigner looking for a samurai sword. So in the English version of the game, the joke is preserved by them speaking in Japanese. That makes less sense the more you think about it though, so the joke got dropped altogether in all English releases of the game. I won't lie, I do wish it stayed. Okay, but that was all just small potatoes. What people really yearn for is to learn how the localization affects characterization. And for the record, when I refer to characterization, I refer to the on-screen mannerisms and behaviors of a character. Basically how the plot chooses to portray a character in scenes. And what better place to start than our leading main man, Neku. For those unaware, Neku's story revolves around him being the most emo and antisocial boyo out there. By the game's end, he learns that people are pretty alright actually. Players of the English release were able to quickly realize just how emo Neku is by how rude he chose to be to everyone around him. He calls people names, he's willing to cuss them out, he's hardly even capable of speaking to someone in a way that isn't condescending. But many players have also noted before that a lot of this behavior just isn't present in the Japanese version. So what gives? Did the English localization team just make up their own character? Well, it pretty much boils down to cultural differences. In Japan, a much greater emphasis is put on being polite, to such a degree that in social situations where a deeper layer of familiarity has not yet been established, choosing to not be overtly polite is akin to being rude. They don't have as much of a need to pepper their language with profanity to get the message across that they don't have any respect for you. So if you directly translate Japanese Neku to English, you get a character that just seems pretty antisocial and introverted, and that's about it. If Neku does that in Japanese, the appropriate reaction is, "Dang man, what's your damage?" In English, it's more like, "Okay, someone's a little moody." And that's all a result of different cultural contexts. Neku telling Shiki to screw off in English was deemed as being equivalent to him just being blunt to her in Japanese, because frankly speaking, it is. Therefore, the character was preserved. Or rather, they are adjusted to fit a different local environment, which is what localization is at its core. Now, I have a theory regarding this one. A Neku theory. When the animation first released without English voice acting, it also lacked an English localization. I cannot express how much of my soul was lost when I saw Sho Minamimoto saying crush instead of crunch. And amongst a healthy host of other issues, the animation was panned often for its portrayal of Neku. He just wasn't rude in this version, it seemed. And I suspect that's because of a lack of localization. The character begins to feel wrong because this is effectively Japanese Neku speaking in English. And Japanese Neku just doesn't get the same message across authentically in English. As for one of the secondary leads, Shiki, a similar thing went down for her. Not as extreme as Neku, but Shiki notably does not really use honorifics to refer to Neku in Japanese. For those that don't know, Japanese honorifics are titles used to acknowledge the status of a person in relation to the speaker. It's like how we use Mrs. and Sir, but a little more elaborate and much more socially expected. So the fact that Shiki leaves them out when talking to Neku, along with other types of language that she chooses to use, establishes that she's trying to become way too friendly way too fast, which creates the contrast between the two that's the bread and butter of their early relationship. In English, this is pretty much preserved, but in my opinion is a little less noticeable. Or at the very least, it takes a little longer for it to settle in just how overly friendly she's trying to be to Neku. Your mileage probably varies there though. The character Beat encountered a similar problem but was solved in a very different way. Beat doesn't use honorifics for gosh dang anyone, which is severely informal. Which means that the Japanese version of Beat has a lot of information packed into just the fact that he omits a title when speaking to people. And we just don't have something like that in English. The language isn't built for this purpose. I've noticed that a lot of Japanese media runs into the issue of what to do with honorifics when localizing. You really do need them to correctly convey information. I mean, in just the 3 characters I've talked about, all 3 get different characterizations from how they use or don't use honorifics. That said, I have been asked to clarify that doing so does not really solve the problem, since honorifics are pretty reliant on the rest of the Japanese language structure to fully function. Still, many localizations leave them in just because it's the best that can be done. But the World Ends With You localization team chose to not use them. Why is that? Well, if I had to speculate, I would guess this is because of what the World Ends With You represents and what its goal is. The characters all go through the kinds of mundane struggles that everyone feels at one point or another. The game is supposed to feel very relatable to the player's life. So to strengthen that relatability, the series always aims to represent the culture of its target demographic. That's why the anime adaptation randomly changed the setting of the game to be like 15 years in the future. So if a release of the game were to include grammatical elements from a foreign culture, that could weaken that aspect for some players. But that's just my conjecture. That isn't ever stated by the localization team or developers. Still, they chose to omit honorifics, so how do you represent Beat's informal way of referring to people? Nicknames, and a lot of them. Beats calls people phones, pinky, to booty, lollipop, iron face, and many more. Because calling someone names in English isn't that far off from avoiding honorifics in Japanese. My source did also clarify though that not all was peachy keen in Beat's localization. He stated that Beat's way of speaking in Japanese was in a rough and tough way that is often associated with delinquents, but the speech style is inherently masculine. The localization decided to translate this in English as African American vernacular English. However, this way of speaking isn't inherently masculine. It's pretty much just a way of speaking English. The only way that AAVE carries the same meaning as Beat's Japanese way of speaking is through a racial stereotype. Now, it is not within the scope of this video to discuss the racial ethics of The World Ends With You. I know that you were all dying to hear me dive into that one, so I'm sorry to disappoint. However, strictly from a localization standpoint, using AAVE for Beat does not carry the same inherent meaning as the Japanese script, and as such would be totally fair to be deemed as a weaker aspect of the localization. Leaning back into fun facts territory, Rhyme is notably not always referred to as female in the Japanese version. In fact, she isn't referred to as female at all until the last third of the game. Prior to that, she always speaks in an androgynous way. Because you can't really speak androgynously in English, and the trait had no other bearing on any other aspect of the game, it was dropped from the international release. Okay, that's most of the main cast done. Hey, what about... Shut up. Let's speed around some Reapers. Izuki Yashiro in the Japanese version liked to speak via emoji and other terms used over text. In 2000s Japan, this would characterize her as a trendy sort of girl. The hip youth. But if she did that in English, she'd sound like some unholy marriage of Koko Ararashi and Futaba Persona 5. We'd get chronically online Izuki is what we'd get. So this was changed to make her lightly Valley Girl as the closest approximation that you could really get without there being an equivalent dialect that existed in English. As for Karya, he speaks with a tilde at the end of a lot of his sentences in Japanese, and that's like all I got. Actually, no, that tilde changes a lot. The fact that they dropped it from the English release led to Uzuki getting freaking framed. You see, on the 4th day of the game— oh wait, I'm still in the spoiler-free section. Bad thing happens. And this is most commonly blamed on Uzuki in the English-speaking community when it's actually Karya's fault. The reason it comes across as ambiguous in English is because the speech bubble where Karya states that it was him comes from off-screen. In Japanese, this is clearly Karya because of the tilde. But in English, people assume that it was Uzuki. Even the Tumblr blog that I use for research, which has a side-by-side translation of the scene, also mistakes the line for Uzuki only in the English end. In Japanese, it correctly identifies the speaker as Karya. This is all to say that Uzuki is innocent. Absolve her. She did nothing wrong. I mean, she did also talk about wanting to shoot random pedestrians later in the game, but ignore that. Then there's Sho Minamimoto. I'm gonna keep this one real brief because this could easily turn into a massive rabbit hole. Since all of Minamimoto's dialogue is based around math speak, he had to have practically all of it rewritten from the ground up in order to fit math into the linguistics of another language. As such, an inevitable amount of subtext is lost when translating Minamimoto. However, my source noted that his localization is still incredibly impressive for just how much of the character and meaning managed to be preserved. A notable instance of this is his big debut scene. Minamimoto would use the number 4 in a pun since 4 in Japanese sounds like the word for death. This was localized as Minamimoto saying it's times 2 die. A very good way to convey the same meaning and still have a number in there. Also noteworthy is that Minamimoto in Japanese recites a mnemonic for pi when he's drawing his demonic hopscotch cord in the back alley. Because mnemonics are really hard to translate, the English translation doesn't and just has him say pi straight up. This one is really odd to me since English totally does have several mnemonics for pi. In the English localization of the anime, they did opt to use one of those. Sir, I bear a rhyme excelling in mystic power and magic spelling. This isn't the only time that the anime's localization gets a leg up on the games either. Around the same time, Joshua makes a mention of undergrounds outside of Shibuya. Undergrounds are where the games take place, by the way. He specifies the Shinjuku Underground, which would go on to be a focal point in the second entry. This mention was straight up removed in the English version for some reason, but preserved in the English localization of the anime, which released after the second game. Then there's She Who Haunts My Nightmares, Coco. Coco made her first appearance in a game that never got localized, and she didn't get substantial characterization for another 4 years in English. How was that handled? Well, the gist of her way of speaking is the same in both languages, but the subtext is pretty different. Both aim to make her speak in a feminine yet annoying way. In English, this is through making her say stuff like, are you for reals? Did you, like, seriously forget about me? But in Japanese, she speaks in a way that people actually use. It's part of a whole stereotype about the people who hang around the Harajuku area. So my source speculates this is why Coco is more popular in Japan. She comes across as endearing over there, while over here I can get sent coasters of Coco for my birthday solely in an attempt to be an assault on my mental health. Basically, the stereotype that Coco is a riff-off doesn't really exist outside of Japan. Now all that's left to do is to talk about some more miscellaneous stuff. I wasn't given many details on this one, but both my own source and the Tumblr blog praised the localization of Hanakoma for just how charming the guy is, with a note that they changed his birthday to be 1 day earlier in English. This has also kept me up at nights. Like, the English birthday makes more sense with the lore, but why was it only changed there? In older videos, I've made a big stink before about the naming discrepancy with the in-universe band Death March/Death March. Its name fluctuates depending on the entry, and it doesn't help that there is an official IRL band based on it, and it only uses one of those names. But what I failed to realize once in the years that I've spent thinking about this is that the confusion is due to localization. The band is called Death March in Japanese, but was localized to Death March. This is why all of the games refer to it as Death March, and the anime and IRL band are called Death March. And in the case of the anime, that goes for all languages. I assume it wasn't changed to match the English game because of all the posters in the show that still read Death March. And then there's Tin Pin Slammer, a silly little mini-game / in-universe TV show which received a lot of changes in localization. In Japanese, the whole thing is a sort of affectionate parody of shonen media called Marble Slash. All the rage with these Japanese elementary schoolers. So when localizing literally just Tin Pin and its associated characters, and I have to stress, no other parts of the game, they decided to 4-kids it by doing stuff like giving the characters Shudo and Yokoyan the names of Shooter and Yan Scammer and renaming the tournaments to Slam-Offs. My source noted, and I quote, "It would have been really easy to turn Tinpin into a mean-spirited parody that looked down on the Japanese properties, but the localization retains the utter love and genuine affection for kids like Shooter," end quote. Which is really neat and really funny to me. I've seen a lot of people make jokes on what would happen if 4 kids localized The World Ends With You, and it absolutely cracks me up to know that it kind of sort of did happen to some small capacity. Now, this video has been largely focused on the English localization, but I do want to briefly touch on the Italian one. You see, the switchboard of the game was the first version to feature one, and a massive portion of its dialogue was taken from a fan translation as reported by one of the people who worked on it, Reddit user Muster92. While they report that they were not contacted beforehand, they are pretty happy to see that their work ended up in an official product. Though, if you ask me, I do think it's a little whack that they are not credited in the game's credits. Alright, that's all I got on spoiler-free stuff, so if you haven't completed both games, now is the time to go. It's been lovely having you here. Thanks for being here, and remember to take your goodie bag. Okay, are we good? Great! Let's talk about Joshua. No source I had really talked about Joshua's localization a ton, but the lore around him does seem to have a fair amount of changes because of how the secret reports were localized. In fact, across the series, I'd say that the single highest density of localization errors are present within the secret reports. This is most noticeable in Neo since things stated just plain don't fit with the first game, but the first game is also frankly just as flawed. As far as characterization goes, Zeta Vector noted that Hanekoma is always reflected accurately across the 2 languages, so no issues there. But like I said, the lore itself isn't one-to-one when it comes to how Joshua works. For those of you who ignored my warning or need a reminder, Joshua is the composer of Shibuya and is like the god of the city in the first game. The composer was implied to be a sort of middle ground between angels and reapers. Then, in Neo, it was stated that composers are angels, not a middle ground. So what's up with that? Well, in the Japanese reports of the first game, it's never implied that composers are the stage before angels. Instead, it's stated that composers decide who become angels, similarly to how a conductor can decide who becomes a reaper, which makes more sense as to why the change happened in later media. The Japanese reports also do not state that a composer can only step down through death, which does change the way that I view Joshua's character a fair amount, and is a case where I much prefer the English implication, even if I guess it's not 100% accurate. And that is all just the tip of the series' iceberg. Since the second entry garnered a lot of very well thought out and good faith arguments regarding its localization, that one has a lot more documentation, on top of the fact that the game itself is like twice the size. So since I still want to get this video out in time for the anniversary, we'll put a cap on things here and cover that next time in a video that will have an even more normal comment section than this one, I'm sure. But in the meantime, let me know if there's stuff I missed. Although preferably only if you're actually fluent in both English and Japanese. I too can use Google Translate, and that's not exactly helpful here. Obviously, I know very little about the Japanese language, but I did do my best to keep this video as accurate as can be. That said, I'm sure there's going to be a pinned comment sooner or later with corrections, so have a look-see there. And maybe I'll cover them in part 2, which will happen, oh, I don't know. You free next anniversary? And I can't end any video without thanking the 6 coolest people in the world: Bacon Insert Noun, Kaiser, Willpower784, Wonderland Snack, The Missing Samurai, and then our patrons. Don't forget to check out the new World Ends With You wiki, and bye!